Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone online. I'm just going to give 1 minute for people to join the webinar and then we'll get started. Okay, I can see people are trickling in. So, hello everybody.
11.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. So hi everyone, on behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the second in a series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today we are so excited to have not just one but two talks on Sweetclover, presented by Bruce Bennett and Dr. Katie Spellman. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Bruce Bennett is the Yukon Conservation Data Center Coordinator at Government of Yukon. His presentation identifies the source of Sweetclover from its introduction in the 1900s and discusses issues and impacts of its spread in the north. So I'll hand things over to you, Bruce. Take it away.
Let's see. Great. Does that show up now then?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Well, and thank you for inviting me to the presentation today. So are you just seeing my screen, or are you seeing, do I have to close anything?
No, it's full screen. It looks perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joanna, for the introduction. And yeah, my name's Bruce Bennett. I'm the coordinator of the Yukon Conservation Data Center in Whitehorse, Yukon. But I've been really interested in the spread of invasive species and exotic species since I arrived in Yukon in 1995. So my presentation today will be to go through a history of where the Sweetclover came from, where it's going, and what's the big issue about Sweetclover? Why are they a problem? So, let's see. Okay, so in the early days, almost all of our exotic plants were introduced through agriculture. And we had some really early botanists like John McCowan, who came up in 1902 and did a really big inventory of the areas around Dawson City. And because he had heard that we could grow cabbages in the north that were bigger than basketballs, and he didn't believe it. He thought it was one of these northern stories. So he got a trip to Yukon to check out whether this was real. So he came with Agriculture Canada and made a huge collection of all the plants in the Klondike area. So most of our early information came from surveys such as that. Let's see. It's not advancing. There we go. And so you can see that before the highways were in Yukon, all the exotic plants, and these weren't invasive at the time, they were just introduced to European plants, were associated with the farms, mainly around Dawson, but you can see that there's a dot in central Yukon. That's the Pelly Farm. That's one of the oldest farms, and it's still in existence. And the dot right at the bottom below Whitehorse there was along the railroad tracks near Carcross. And so most of the so I went back to look and see where, when Sweetclover was first mentioned. And the first introduction of Sweetclover was to be used for agriculture. And so there were a number of stations in Alaska that were mentioned. They talk about the Rampart Station, which was established in 1900, and they tried to grow sweet clover, but it didn't work very well for them. Fairbanks, where Katie is now, is actually where the University of Fairbanks was the original agricultural station. And so they were experimenting with a couple of different sweet clovers, including yellow, white, and this is the first time I learned that there were two different strains. One was called biennial white and the other one was called Arctic. And they mentioned that the biennial white didn't survive very well, but the Arctic was much more hardy. So that's something I've got to follow up more with. Then the long-standing and continuous to this day station was in Palmer, and they were also practicing with sweet clover. And this was something I learned while I was putting this together, because I've always known of sweet clover being used as a green manure crop. And what they mean by that is, as sweet clover grows, it gathers nitrogen into its body. And then what you do is you plow it into your fields, and as the plants decompose, they slowly release nitrogen. So it's a green manure, that's what they mean. But it was also interesting that they used it as a hay crop, because I don't hear very often of people feeding sweet clover to animals, but that's a very important concept too. But you know, in the 30s, the conclusion was sweet clovers don't do very well. They're not going to survive the winter. And so the earliest collection that was escaped from cultivation was in Alaska that I was able to find. And this was in 1931, and it was at the Palmer Station. So as you saw in the previous slide, they were actually experimenting with sweet clover in 1931. So this one, I guess, got over the fence and onto the road. And the first known collection in Yukon was in 1935, but it was considered to be introduced, but it seems like it was still in cultivation at that time. So it's not clear whether that was an escape plant. And so as you can see, the photograph on the left here is of that sweet clover from Dawson. And so until the highways were put in, this was what the distribution of sweet clover was known in, according to ACEPIC, which is the Alaskan Exotic Plant Information Center. And most of these, well, all of these are associated with agricultural stations. So there was an agricultural station on Kodiak Island and the one up in Fairbanks. And then there was also the first roadside sweet clover to escape from cultivation in Yukon was in 1944 in Mayo in central Yukon. So here's a photo of that collection. You can see it's producing seed. And but in general, sweet clover until the 40s was completely associated with agriculture. It hadn't really escaped from cultivation. And between the 40s and the 70s is when Yukon had all its major highways constructed. So there was most people know about the Alaska Highway, which was put in the 1940s, completed in 42. And then there was a highway that joined Whitehorse to Dawson in the 50s, and other sites. There was the Canal Road that was also completed in the 40s to move oil from the Northwest Territories, from Norman Wells over to Alaska. So actually, I think that one just went to Whitehorse, and it only ran for a year, but they built a road along there. So those were some of our major highways. But because we didn't have a lot of exotic plants in the environment, the highway construction didn't move any of the plants. So when we look at after the highways were completed and you look at the distribution of exotic plants between 1899 and 1975, almost all of these are still associated with the agricultural sites. And there's not a strong correlation with the roadsides. You can see there's just as many plants well away from the roads as there are within the roads, except for perhaps in the Whitehorse area where we were getting a lot more traffic. But overall, the roads didn't really seem to be a vector for species to move. So this is all exotic species, not just Sweetclover. So by 1975, Sweetclover still wasn't in the wild throughout Yukon and Alaska. There is a lot more sites in Northwest Territories, so this is something I hope to follow up on in the future. I don't know the answer right now what the source of those are. Many of them are probably agricultural stations that were in Northwest Territories. But all this information is available online through the EPIC data portal. And so this is what the North looked like in 1975. And this is the way we maintained our highways until relatively recently. Most of our highways weren't paved, and so you would just grade them every year. And what highways would do is they drive off the road, put their blade down and drive one way, and then go around cross the road, go on the other side and grade the other side. That's how they kept the willows out. And so there wasn't highway mowing, and there wasn't a lot of issues about spreading things because there still were no exotic species on the roadsides. But as you can imagine, if you want to grow something, one of the best places to grow something is disturbed sands and gravels, especially moist disturbed sands and gravels. So it was a perfect habitat for exotic species invasion. But it seems like the summers were too short, the winters were too cold, and we as the early experiments on Sweetclover showed, most of the Sweetclover wasn't able to successfully reproduce even if it did escape onto the roadsides. So this is when I arrived in Yukon in 1995, and I came into Whitehorse, which is in that lower dot, slightly larger dot in Yukon. And my first experience here was you'd find Sweetclover occasionally, and it did seem like it was beginning to spread along the road, the Alaska Highway in Whitehorse, but it was an occasional weed. And so I went back and I looked, and there were a few collections in the 50s and a few collections in the 60s, from the airport and places like that. And they did mention that it wasn't, that it was an occasional weed even at that time. And the interesting thing is, other than Kodiak, there's none in Alaska, and there's also none being reported in the Dawson area, which is also quite interesting. But once again, NWT leads the way in having Sweetclover. By 2000, though, something was changing. Our winters were getting warmer, and our summers were getting wetter. I always think of 2001 being the year that I really noticed a difference, where I began to travel down the highways and our fireweed was being replaced by Sweetclover. And you can see the central Yukon, that's following the Klondike Highway up towards Dawson. And that's part of the driest part of Yukon, and it's also where all the fires occur. So we call that the fire belt. So we have a brochure called Driving the Fire Belt, because unlike other areas in Yukon, that's a particularly dry area, and it has fires about every 60 years. But we were getting a lot more moisture during the summer, and so the sweet clover was able to flower and successfully reproduce. You can see that we're starting to have dots around Dawson as well. And the interesting thing about that was I had old timers come to me and say, what is this white flowered plant? I've never seen it before. I've lived in Dawson since the 30s. I've never seen this plant before. And yet it was in Dawson in the 30s, but it suddenly by 2000 became much more widespread. And so at that time, we did a roadside survey because we wanted to find out where this was and was it a problem? The highways department was finding that it was really affecting their mowing program, because typically they could just mow once in the spring and then maybe later on in the fall, but usually you could do one pass. But the way sweet clover was growing, it was so thick that when you mowed it the first time, it would bend over, and then you'd have to sharpen your blades and mow it again. So it was becoming a lot more expensive for highways. So they wanted to see where sweet clover was and whether it was motorhomes and visitors that were spreading sweet clover along the roadsides. So that was what they, oh, and I've stolen these slides from a previous PowerPoint that I showed at the beginning there. So these are just copied the slides over, but we were looking at, you know, how did things get here? And what we found was that most of the spread was by highway construction, maintenance, mowing, and also reseeding. The exotic species were coming in from being reseeded, but it wasn't sweet clover. We have no evidence of sweet clover ever being hydroseeded. The plants that they were using in their seeding programs, a lot of them are now known to be invasives, like tufted vetch, Vicia cracca, and reed canary grass. They were, and the most common exotic species, which is also invasive, is smooth brome, and we're beginning to see the effects of that as well. But that'll be another talk. But there is no evidence that sweet clover was ever seeded along the highways. And so these were all the sites, 191 sites that they stopped at and recorded all the exotic plants that were found. And one of the main points was to look at sweet clover. And so every site, they recorded all the exotic species, but they were really trying to look for sweet clover. And you can see these big, thick stems that were causing problems for the mowing equipment. And so they discovered that, you know, in 2007, they were on all surveyed highways. The highest concentrations were near towns, and the highest concentrations were associated with recent road maintenance. It was found to be in gravel pits, and we've equated the movement of gravel to the spread of sweet clover to new areas. And the least affected areas were the Haines Road, the South Canal Road, and the Robert Campbell highways, where the native vegetation was growing right up to the edge of the highways, and they weren't doing the major mowing programs in the same way. And it was also determined that it was beginning to spread into the rivers. And so it was identified at that time the Yukon rivers could be at risk. And so here's a map showing the distribution. It's very colorful, and you can always refer to this. Hopefully this will be recorded and you can come back and have a look at this. But those gray areas are areas where there's very little sweet clover. 10 years later, in 2017, we repeated the roadside survey to get a better idea of focusing specifically on sweet clover. And at that time, the NWT did a similar roadside survey, and we both used the same practice to gather the information, so the data is comparable across Yukon and NWT, and it was happening at the same year. And this is what we discovered. So the areas that remained unaffected or had low amounts of sweet clover were those highways that didn't have the same kind of maintenance regime, and but you can see that it's still spreading. The interesting thing about the Carcross Road was it was being hand pulled. So the highway at the bottom there, why it isn't solid sweet clover is because individuals were going out and pulling every year. And so just about at the end here, so this is what sweet clover looked like in 2000. It's a repeat of that slide I showed earlier. But by 2020, this is what it looked like. So I think it's pretty impressive when you see there's nothing in Alaska except for Anchorage, it looks like, by 2000. But by 2020, it's all the way here. One of my biggest concerns is Inuvik. I've gone in and we found a patch that came up in Inuvik. We've pulled it a couple of years, but with COVID, I haven't been able to go back and attack that site. And I suspect that all along the Mackenzie River is now going to be complete sweet clover. We have managed to control sweet clover on the Dempster Highway. That's why there's no dots between Yukon and Inuvik. But again, we're doing that actively, trying to pull all the sweet clover, and we've kept it in check for northern Yukon. And as I mentioned, that we were worried about the effects it was having on the rivers. So that ridge that's behind us in the photo there, that's the NWT. So this is the Labiche River that flows into the Liard River, and just over that hill is the Northwest Territories, and this was what the sweet clover looked like. We think this sweet clover was seeded, and I've heard a bunch of different theories. Some people said that it was the outfitters seeding to provide forage for their animals. Other people said it was the pipelines were being seeded. I haven't been able to find documentation to either of these theories, but I had never seen the amount of sweet clover on the river bars. So where I'm standing when I'm taking this photo to those people traditionally would have been a gravel bar. And so when you have this much change, there's now no place for birds like spotted sandpipers to nest. And so this was an area that used to have lots of peregrine falcons, but the main food source are the shorebirds, and the shorebirds have no place to nest anymore. So once you lose the shorebirds, you could be losing the peregrine falcons. I was concerned about fire, but I hear from our fire folks that it is too diffuse, so it doesn't burn very well, but maybe Katie can speak to that. We do worry about smooth brome because it is one that is an ignition source. And this was also happening in Alaska, so and we do know where the source of this came from. It was the agricultural farms upriver at Telegraph Creek in British Columbia that flowed down the Stikine River into the delta. And you can imagine what affects having something like this in this kind of a situation. What was happening is the delta, which used to flood, has now become channelized. It doesn't, the river doesn't move back and forth because the sand is being stabilized by all the plants. It's changing all the pollinators. It's changing the nesting, and also a lot of competition from other natural processes. So this was a photo by Michael Shepard, and he produced a really good paper in 2007 with Matt Carlson, who's got my job in Alaska for the Alaska Natural Heritage Program. And they did this foundational paper about the spread of non-native plants in Alaska. I think this is my last slide here. Highway hazard. You can see the wildlife sign there of elk crossing, and that's over my head, so that's over 6 feet tall. So if there are animals coming out of the surrounding forest being attracted to the sweet clover, there's a lot of worry about collision, and so that's why they're trying to mow it. Also, we've discovered that mule deer, which have recently moved into Yukon, in the fall when they're hunted, almost all of their antlers are stained green, and that's because they're going to the roadsides and eating sweet clover. So, and we are finding that moose are using sweet clover in the winter. I believe Alaska's found moose will eat sweet clover in the spring, but otherwise don't use it. So there's lots of questions, but it's certainly changing the dynamics of our ecosystem. It still is a relatively new introduction. If you think of it, it's really only been the last 20 years or something. So we are still in the early stages of learning what the effects of sweet clover will be. But I think with that, I think that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bruce, for that great presentation. We are just about at the halfway mark, so I think if folks have questions for Bruce, if you could just hang on to them for the moment, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the hour. But for now, I will switch us over to our second presenter. So let me switch the presenter. There we go. So Katie, you should now be able to share your screen. Perfect. So I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Katie Spellman. Dr. Katie Spellman is a research assistant professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And her presentation will highlight 15 years of research conducted in boreal and Arctic Alaska on the vulnerability of different habitats, vectors of spread, and ecological impacts and control of introduced sweet clover. So with that, I'll hand it over. You can go ahead, Katie.
All right. There'll be plenty of echoes from Bruce. Let me see. Is it still showing? The screen?
Nope, I see. Click exit full screen.
All right, let's try this again.
There.
Now it looks good.
All right, great. My kids are also feeding themselves right now as we're doing this in the pandemic work life. So if you hear cereal pouring, it's my kids. So I titled this 15 years of research, and actually it was 15 years ago when I was in my 20s that I got to meet Bruce because he closely collaborates with us in Alaska all the time. But as Bruce mentioned, sweet clover has been experimented with for much longer than 15 years. It's just in the past 15 years that we've built a research body on sweet clover as a non-native introduced plant species. So I've been working on this for a long time, along with many other people in Alaska, and today it's our most researched invasive plant species in the state of Alaska. So I'm going to just cover three main topics. Some of the history that echoes the history that Bruce mentioned, the introduction of sweet clover to Alaska and how it's been spreading. And then we've been doing some work on the vulnerable habitats in Alaska. Where should we be looking for this? Where should we be prioritizing early detection? And then we've actually had a pretty strong body of research on the impacts of sweet clover here in the boreal forests of Alaska. And then finally, we've had some great work being done on how to control sweet clover and what are the most effective methods. All right. So like Bruce said, this is a plant that is of concern mostly because it is so prolific. 350,000 seeds per head. The seeds last 80 years in the seed bank, and we have some buried bag studies here in Alaska where they dug it up and it's still viable. And it also has coumarin in it. Bruce, I know you mentioned that you hadn't known it was used as hay, and I think that people hesitated using it as a hay crop because of the coumarin. The coumarin, when it starts to break down in hay, it can, it's an anticoagulant, right? So it can cause animals to bleed and not be able to coagulate their blood. And so I think that people have kind of hesitated. I always imagine, like, okay, if Sweetclover went in for an interview as a job, right? You know how they always ask what's your greatest strength and what's your greatest weakness? And I always imagine Sweetclover, you know, the reason that we brought it to the north to begin with was because it can change our soils and make them more fruitful for the plants that we want to grow. But that's also its greatest problem, is that now it can change our soils and transform ecosystems, which is why in our Bruce showed the exotic plants information clearinghouse data. In our database, we have a ranking system also, and it's for that reason that we have this as a highly ranked species in Alaska. So here's another great historical photo, Bruce. This is a, so like Bruce showed, 1913 was the first seeding that was recorded. But it was also experimented with widely. In Fort Yukon, there was a patch that was overwintering really well, and the agricultural researchers at my institution, University of Alaska Fairbanks, noted this in Fort Yukon, and there it is right there among the cabins, that someone, and I read in this Cleva saddle, these papers are also really rich with some history. Somebody had brought it from a seed catalog, I guess, and were using it for making honey and as a green manure, as Bruce mentioned. And so they took some of the seeds of this and they planted them in the Palmer Research Station also, along with some of the cultivars that Bruce was mentioning. And they found that this particular strain, which they called Arctic, was so much more hardy. And you could see these are the crown buds. These are some historical photos of their experiments with the crown buds. The Madrid was a strain that was in the lower 48 that they think was one of the original strains that was brought over from the Mediterranean to North America. And then they had a Yukon strain, which was being grown in Canada, northern Saskatchewan, and then some other strains that they were using. But this Arctic, you can really see those crown buds were solid, and they had a great start for being able to overwinter in our cold winters. So that, like, 20 years worth of research was put into making this plant cold hardy for Alaska so that we could use it to enrich our soils for agriculture. And then, as Bruce said, it started to spread. And we here in Alaska, we also know that equipment is a big deal. We know that gravel transport is a really big deal. So this is Gino Graziano right here. He is one of our invasive species managers and educators in the state, and he actually produced a great massive online open course. And here's the web link if you're interested in learning more about Sweetclover and its control. And as a part of that, he details some of his work surveying all the gravel pits around Alaska so that we can cut off this area, this pipeline of spread of the transport of gravel. And he started a weed-free certified program for our gravel pits in Alaska. And then finally, the road graders is a big problem here, just like Bruce detailed in his talk. And you can see, like, look at that garden, a perfect garden going up the Dalton Highway, which is the road that connects the lower part of Alaska to our oil fields. And then Bruce, thanks for setting me up for this vector of spread. So we started noticing, as Bruce mentioned, that wildlife was feeding on sweet clover because it's this new lush source of vegetation, and we wondered how could it be acting as a vector? Could moose eat it? And then, like, think about how far a moose can walk in a day, right? Miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers. And could, when they poop it out the other end, could the seeds still be viable? And if so, what is the potential? And so Bruce and my buddy, Steve Seafelt, he actually fed sweet clover seeds to some of the moose on our experimental farm, and he collected the poop for many, many days, and then he looked at the germination rates after each passing of the sweet clover seeds. And so the good news is that most passed within 2 or 3 days, which, you know, maybe that's not such good news because a moose can walk a long way in 2 or 3 days. Some seeds still remain viable, like almost all the seeds remain viable. They have a hard seed coat, and it was just perfect for making the seeds germinable, right? They can germinate really easy. Some stayed and remained viable 11 days after the moose had eaten it. And so that's a little bit scary. And if you want to read more about that study, Steve had a great paper that came out of that that documented the spread through moose. And we now, so this is the zoomed in map of that Bruce showed. Now we have a problem on our hands. The greatest strength that sweet clover brought to our state is also the greatest weakness, and we are concerned. And we've done some work. Jaranovich et al. Did some work using climate envelope models to try to predict and project what might happen with sweet clover in the future. As Bruce showed, it started creeping up highways, but are there other suitable habitats? And they used a really neat approach of like these geographic scale plus local disturbance factor models to be able to anticipate where sweet clover might end up. And in those models, they project that by 2031, sweet clover will be able to persist at higher elevations than it does today. And also, but the good news is it still largely remains near the roadsides in those models. So why? Well, we know something about which habitats are most susceptible to sweet clover in Alaska through this 15 years of research. And number one is the soils. So Steve Sparrow, who is a really respected agricultural researcher here in Alaska, he found that alkaline soils they support growth of sweet clover much better than acidic soils. So this is pretty good news because we have our black spruce forests in the north are pretty acidic, right? But when Jeff Kahn went out to go look at different habitats, these are other really great papers documenting which habitats are susceptible to sweet clover. So alkaline soils, and so in addition to those practices, Bruce, that you were mentioning of maintaining the road edges, certain highways with certain soil types are going to be more or less vulnerable just based on that base soil, whether it's alkaline or not. And one thing that that Jeff Kahn did find was that the braided river basins that had soils that were more alkaline than the roadsides, that they tended to be more vulnerable. So those vulnerable interfaces, like Bruce mentioned in the Yukon, in Alaska too. This is actually my husband's graduate work. He worked with Trish. Can you let Coop out so he doesn't bark? they went and they documented all the major road river interfaces in Alaska and looked at the distribution of sweet clover along the rivers and on the roads. And there he is. This is my husband, Blaine. We actually met, I married my husband. We met through sweet clover. So this is a really sweet story. But he was doing his work and I was doing my work on sweet clover. So one thing that he found, my husband, he went and documented this new shade environment. Like Bruce said, on those riparian areas, it is typically really wide open, like the nesting habitat, Bruce, that you mentioned. And also for floodplain succession, that open light environment is really important for things like willows. And he documented seedling recruitment over a number of years in areas with and without sweet clover. And then he also did a controlled removal of sweet clover to look at seedling recruitment. And he found that the willows willow recruitment was reduced when sweet clover created a novel shade environment on the floodplains. And so wildfire was another thing. People were worried right around the same time when me and my husband were falling in love in the greenhouse, growing our sweet clover seedlings in the greenhouse. People were really concerned. 2004 was one of the highest fire years on record. And so my early work on this topic was looking at whether or not sweet clover could invade our burned areas. And I surveyed every quarter mile along every road and burn scar overlap. So wherever there was a road, wherever there was a burn scar, we surveyed every quarter mile, ran about 500 transects and looked for sweet clover on the roadside and whether it had spread into the burns or not. We also did a controlled experiment where we brought the burn soils to the greenhouse to control for climatic factors and to control for propagular pressure. And we found that, yes, the wildfire scars are vulnerable, that sweet clover could move to some degree. It only, at that time, it had only moved a maximum of 10 meters into burned areas. That was the maximum that it would spread. These are heavy seeds. They're not spreading very fast. And that areas where the regions of Alaska where the soils were more alkaline had a greater movement of sweet clover into the burned areas. But the nice reassurance is that most of the soils were pretty acidic, and that the mosses, colonizing mosses, really in my greenhouse study, colonizing mosses reduced the success, the germination rates, and the establishment rates of sweet clover because the moss was protecting the burned area. The moss colonizes really fast post-fire. And we had a student follow up on that and look at whether a seed bank sweet clover seed would act differently. So like, let's say the sweet clover came before the moss recolonized. It had, so these are some moss species, and this is the emergence of sweet clover. If they were under the moss and it was very low emergence, when we sprinkled the seeds on top of the moss, though, we got some emergence, but it was still pretty low. So that's our mosses, yay for the little guys. So while we were doing that work and we were like walking through the sweet clover, we just noticed that it was buzzing with bees. Sweet clover is a pollinator attractor. So we started worrying. A lot of these freshly burned areas, next year it comes back strong in our berry plants, blueberries, lowbush cranberries. These are great berry picking areas. So we started to worry and wonder about sweet clover changing pollination to our accessible berry patches. And we set up a big citizen science monitoring network, a community science monitoring network. It had 250 volunteers all over Alaska, and we documented the flowering times of sweet clover relative to two of our important berry plants, lowbush blueberry and lowbush cranberry. And we found that it did overlap. So there was potential. So like you can see the overlap, a little bit of overlap on the extreme early timing for sweet clover, a little bit of overlap in the flowering times with blueberry, and then pretty significant overlap with glowbush cranberry. So then we set up an experiment where we very carefully outplanted flowering sweet clover into berry patches in our experimental forest. Ooh, excuse me, I'm still talking this. And we found that sweet clover changed the pollinator communities when we added it. It brought in a whole bunch of more types of pollinators in the sites where we added sweet clover compared to the sites without sweet clover. We did not, like at the large site level, we did not find that it shifted fruit production, but we did find that it changed the seeds per berry, which means that if we had no change in overall fruit, but a change in seeds per berry, that we were seeing a change in the quality of the pollen being delivered. So more outcrossing when across individuals, more outcrossing across individual berries when sweet clover was there compared to when it wasn't. And we saw that it shifted where the pollinators were pollinating. This was another study that we did. When we added sweet clover, the pollinators were focusing more on the plants close, the berry plants close to the sweet clover, and focusing less on the plants farther out. And we think that that seed outcrossing was due to more butterflies and moths entering the scene when the sweet clover was added, and they had a less efficient foraging strategy, so they would flit around a little bit more across the plants compared to when just bees and flies were there, more efficient pollinators. So finally, the control, we've had some neat work being done on how, okay, we know it's a problem, that it can cause some problems on riparian areas and in berry patches, and it can kind of get into burns, but probably not a big problem in burns. And so we have focused a lot on our education. We wrote a curriculum guide for our schools and trained hundreds of teachers in this curriculum. We have a reporting app for folks out in rural Alaska to report it when they see it. And a lot of it actually ends up being teachers and students. And we have that as a function. Like Bruce mentioned, on sections of the highway in Yukon, we are advocating hand pulling when it's small patches, and at road river interfaces, often they're pulling still to prevent any seeds from moving downstream from the roads. You got to catch them early because the seeds last 80 years, or you got to be really dedicated, right? Here's some students in Shagaluk, Alaska, who found this is not white sweet clover, this is a different plant, but right behind them, they found white sweet clover, and they've been pulling it by hand to keep it at bay. And so Steve Seefelt and Jeff Kahn, who did a lot of work on how we can control it, they looked at flaming it. So can you burn it? Can you cut it? And like if it's too much for hand pulling, what can you do best? And then they also looked at which herbicide might work the best for sweet clover. And they found that if you're going to cut it, they did a 2.5 centimeter cut and a 10 centimeter cut. If you're going to cut it low, because it can still come back and produce viable seeds if you cut it at 10 centimeters. If you're going to flame it, you should flame it in your first year, and don't wait till year 2 to flame it. And Bruce, I'm not sure about the fire threat from the second year, like when they're dry husks that just stay up there in the second year. I don't know if anybody's done any work on that yet. So that'll be interesting. And then if you're going to use herbicides, they tested a host of herbicides here, and the one that they found worked the best and eliminated seed production was the chlorosulfuron at the recommended dosage. They tried to reduce the dosage in some of their trials, but they found the full dosage of this one worked the best. And then first years, like in this picture, first years were better, responded better. And then in Alaska, anytime that there's a control effort, we just replant after controlling. And here's an example of where sweet clover had been removed, and then they just replanted some grasses there. And yeah, so the moral of the story is there's lots to learn from each other, and that this plant is a really interesting and important one for us to study here in the North. And I can't wait to hear questions so that we can learn more from each other.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Dr. Katie Spellman. That was a super interesting presentation. And now if folks have questions, you can please enter them into the question and answer box, and I will read them out to our speakers. You can ask questions to either Bruce or Katie about their presentation. So got one question here. It says, in Fort Smith, NT, we do some prescribed burning of a field that is predominantly sweet clover. When it is 2+ years and cured, it seems to burn pretty well, but still rebounds. So I guess that's more of a comment, but interesting.
Bruce, I noticed on one of your pictures that there was that like powdery mildew. I'm curious if you've had any observation. We see it here often, like a powdery mildew colonizes the second year of sweet clover and sometimes the first year. Do you think that there's any hope there that it's starting to get some natural predators? It's getting chewed up too by herbivores. I'm just curious if you've noticed any.
That's one of the things that I was pointing out. There are certain things that are being attracted to sweet clover. So there's a blister beetle, a sweet clover blister beetle, which is exotic, which we've found here. But since it's only been about 20 years, I think it's still in the spreading phase, and so it's ripe for all sorts of things to start taking over. So far, I haven't seen any fungus that has controlled it. I can't answer your question though about the fire. Our wildland fire people have tried to burn the stands on the side of the road, and they found that it wasn't as big of as an ignition source as things like the grasses. They say it's just too diffuse, it's too spread out, so it doesn't, you have to sort of crunch it together to light it. And so if you take a bunch of sweet clover and push it all together, it will burn really quickly. But when it's standing and you throw a cigarette underneath it, it's not as likely to ignite as the grasses. But I don't think they've published anything. It was just something that I have heard.
Okay. Got another question here. It says, in places where it has been long established, is it still very dominant? Do either of you?
I'm sorry, I can't find my picture here, so I don't know whether Katie's trying to line up. One thing that we did discover, and back in my slides, there was a pasture on the South Canal Road where they used to have horses, and in that pasture they had sweet clover, and that was back when they're building the Canal Road. And to this day, that's the only place you find sweet clover on the Canal Road, is on that pasture. And they've also discovered that in places that they were doing pipeline restoration and exploration, they had some well sites, so they were all gravel, and so they thought they'd reclaim them by spreading sweet clover seeds. And what has happened is the sweet clover has caused successional stagnation. So the sweet clover is so dense that nothing else is growing in there. So they reseeded these pads in, I think it was the 90s, and now 20 years later, nothing grows in those square pads except for sweet clover. It isn't spreading into the surrounding forest, probably because it's too acidic or it's too mossy, but it's it can stop other things from coming in.
Yeah, that was what Blaine, my husband, his work, showed too, that really it's really shady. It's not that competitive, and he did some interesting competition experiments too, and its greatest enemy is itself. It's like, it's intra-specific competition was its worst enemy, but the shade environment was the big deal for recruitment. But it is, we have noticed, that classic Stickeen River picture that we show in Alaska that both Bruce and I had in our presentations, it has fluctuated through the years, like that some years it'll shrink way down and some years it'll explode way out. And that also was reflected in the agricultural data sets. When you go back and you look at the Klebus et al. Papers of like the 1966 through 1983, they show years where it just flourished agriculturally and years where it didn't. And so the wild populations are responding in similar ways. So.
And I've got a comment about that photo too. If you look closely in that photo, there is just one little hump which doesn't have sweet clover. And then if you look at the photo the next year, there's no sweet clover except on that hump. And that's because sweet clover was so dense that it stopped the germination of the seedlings. And because it's a biennial, the first year it produces the leaves and the next year it flowers. So what we were seeing was that one hump suddenly was the only place where it was flowering, because that was the only place that had the release. And I see this a lot when we're pulling in areas too. If you've got very dense sweet clover, there'll be very few seedlings, but then you pull them and all the soil, all the seed bank will emerge. And that's one thing about control as well. I find that if I pull all the sweet clover, the next year it won't look like I did anything. But if I pull that all again and I'm depleting the seed bank, then it goes down. After the second year, I've depleted by about 90%, because I think most of the sweet clover seed will germinate if it has an opportunity to do so. It only seed banks for a long time if it gets buried.
Well, that's a little encouraging. Then we've got one more question here for you, Bruce, or maybe a suggestion to work with Aurora Research Institute in Inuvik to go after that sweet clover patch in Inuvik.
Oh, I have. Pippa knows about it. Yeah, and she actually went out and pulled it, and she had students go out and pull it, so they know where it is. I just haven't heard from Pippa this year. Mike Oldham, when he was up there doing an inventory, he went and pulled it. And every year, every time I go up to Inuvik, we go and check it out. But it's one of those ones that if you don't get it, it's going to spread. And it's going to be all throughout the community, because Inuvik is ripe for the spread of sweet clover. And everybody who's going, Inuvik is a hub. So everyone who's going to Avavik goes from Inuvik. So if it gets into the airport, it's going to be spread to all the communities. So it's really, Inuvik is a really important hub to keep it out.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we are almost at 1 o'clock my time, so I think I'll let you folks go. But again, I'd like to really thank both of you, Bruce and Katie, for taking the time to present today. And thank you to everyone who joined us as well. If you'd like to join us for some more great webinars this week, you can find more information at nwtcispp.ca or find us on Facebook by searching for NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens. So thank you all so much and take care.
Thank you. We didn't see each other's presentation. That just happened to go so well together.
So perfect, Bruce.
Yeah, they're very complimentary.
International collaboration. Perfect.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.